Gentlemen, the time has come once again to discuss things.
Yeah. So anyway, hi everyone. Welcome to another episode of Geeky Gentlemen. I am Sid Part 2. Joining me today is...
Steve Baxley.
Steve, I need you to ask me a question.
Any specific question?
Yeah, I need you to ask me, what are we talking about today?
Oh, okay. What are we talking about today?
We're talking about the album from Pink Floyd called Animals. Now I need you to ask me another question.
What's the other question?
How did you come up with wanting to talk about that, Ian?
How did you come up with wanting to talk about that, Ian?
So I saw the trailer for the new Flash movie, and I was really annoyed.
What, did you set me up this way?
I was really annoyed, but not for the reasons you might think, but because they used a Pink Floyd song in it. They used Time, and
Oh my God.
I've been a Pink Floyd fan for, I don't know, since fucking middle school, since I got into music. And I'm a comic book fan. And so I'd kind of been waiting for more overlap between Pink Floyd and comic book stuff. We got Vegetable Man in the first Doctor Strange movie. Appreciated that. But then this was it. This was kind of like my moment of a Pink Floyd song in a trailer. And it's for a movie that I don't want to fucking see.
It's for a movie that almost no one wanted to make for like 10 years.
Yeah, so I'm pretty disappointed by that, and so that's part of what's put this topic in my head. The other thing is, this was almost, I shit you not, Steve, we were almost going to do a full podcast on Miss America Pie, the singular 8-minute song. But I decided that might just be a little too much. But in my recent work conversation about that song and its parody song, Soon I'm Gonna Be a Jedi, I brought up Pink Floyd's Animals for having a 17-minute song with almost no lyrics compared to Don McLean's Miss American Pie, which is like a 9-minute song that's almost nothing but lyrics. So I decided, let's talk about animals. I got animals on the brain. I should probably have done Dark Side of the Moon. It would have more directly connected to the Flash movie. But that's how my brain works, everyone.
No. See, this is where you fucked up. Because this episode is going to go live the same weekend as the new Transformers movie, which was also coincidentally previously labeled Dark Side of the Moon. So, you could have had a bunch of people looking up Transformers Dark Side of the Moon while looking up this review, and it could have been great for your numbers.
Yeah, but you don't understand how bad I am at the YouTube thing. Everyone else on YouTube's like, I will jump on the latest trends to get tangential clicks that someone will be into this thing and they'll see me and discover my videos. And I'm like, I'm going to do the opposite thing. I'm going to make videos about what I'm interested in, whether or not it's part of the zeitgeist.
You didn't even time it with the Flash coming out either. You could have at least done that.
No, I refuse.
That's hilarious.
I know. So that's the lovely trip inside my brain, and how it works. I hope you all enjoyed this. The gift shop is right there next to the exit. So
Convenient.
Exactly. That's how I'm gonna get you. Make sure to pick up your "I Was Inside Ian's Brain" and it was a dark and scary place T-shirt. Only $59.95, a bargain. You can't get that anywhere else unless you go to customink.com. Anyway, so Animals, Pink Floyd Animals is It's one of the more like obscure Pink Floyd albums. It's not like fucking their ripoff of Sergeant Pepper or anything, Saucer Full of Secrets, but it's one of the ones that like people don't really talk about. They talk about Dark Side of the Moon, The Wall. Maybe they'll talk about like Atom Heart Mother or Wish You Were Here. I don't think I've ever heard anyone have like any kind of conversation about animals. So I thought it'd be like a fun one, and we're kind of like last minute on the pick here. So I was like, you know what, it's 40-minute album. That's pretty easy to digest. I was able to actually listen to it through it like 3 times today. I didn't start listening to it for this review until this morning, and I got through it like 3 or 4 times. So, Steve, do you have any history? Have you listened to this album before? Have you ever like heard it or heard songs from it before?
Not the specific album, no. You and I have talked about my taste in music before, but I'm not really a big prog rock guy, so Pink Floyd's just not a band I listen to a lot. If I'm listening to anything that goes as far back as the 70s, it's usually going to be more like punk, which is funny because there is apparently a whole history between like punk bands and Pink Floyd and the way they kind of had to push and pull with each other. Yeah. No, more like the punk bands hate Pink Floyd and Pink Floyd thinks it's funny, but it's also because of Johnny Rotten and the Sex Pistols, who's a fucking tool. So it's not like it matters. But anyway, so I'm not really a big Pink Floyd fan. I'm not a big prog rock fan in general. So like I've heard Pink Floyd songs over the years, but this is not an album I'd ever heard until today.
Okay, all right. I love that you brought up the punk thing right off the bat, because I know the fucking Sex Pistols guys, like, I walked around London with a shirt that said "fuck Pink Floyd" on it, and that was blasphemy because they were like angels back then. And I'm like, yeah, this is the guy who's like, you shouldn't have to know how to play instruments or sing to be in a rock band. And Pink Floyd's like, you should probably know how to play instruments and sing and like maybe a little bit about like musical composure to make, you know, music. So yeah, no, like it's so funny how wildly different, because I enjoy some punk stuff, you know, the stuff that's actually musically competent, and I don't enjoy the, like, I guess avant-garde postmodern, you know, art's supposed to be ugly kind of punk music. So it's kind of funny, but no, the Pink Floyd's definitely more like my foundation when it comes to music. Is it's got really, really great compositions, and, you know, just loves to go on these fucking musical journeys that are basically symphonies at a certain point. Like, in just not in like a way of praising it necessarily, just in a way of that is what they are trying to do, is do a symphony kind of thing. When you listen to something like Umaguma or Atom Heart Mother, it's just, you know, these 15-20 minute tracks that are just all about the music, and the lyrics have very little space. Echoes is a big song like that. I think it's like they did a live version that I think is like 30 minutes long or something. So I don't know, they're very much my foundation. A lot of what I like about music is going to come from Pink Floyd, so I'm either going to like really immersive stuff or stuff with like really meaty lyrics, and this album I think does a really good job of like just peppering both of those things. You know, there's very remarkably few lyrics in this 40-minute album, but like what's there is just it's good. It's like, it's really got that like feeling of poetry to it, to me, where the stuff just hits. The lines are just so fucking good. And it's too late to lose the weight you used to need to throw around. Just fucking, that's such a good bit to me. So, I don't know, I'm curious, Steve. Now that I've gushed about what I like about this album, and I do have complaints, and we'll get to those, I'm curious what your thoughts on this album were.
This is really good. My big problem with it is, and I only ever like briefly skimmed the wiki on this, so maybe you know more than I do. But apparently, like, there were songs in this that were played live before and then kind of reworked to be a part of this album. Mm-hmm. My big complaint with this is just, what's the fucking song? Which is weird because there's only so many songs on here. Mm-hmm. But
The really long one is Dogs. And I say that, which is really funny, because, like, I don't think, besides the opening and closing tracks, everything is at least 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah, no, Dogs is 17 minutes. No, it's Pigs on the Wing. So Pigs on the Wing Part 1 and Part 2. I think as a bookend, they don't actually work very well with the album as a whole. I think as just a trilogy of songs, Dogs, Pigs, and Sheep, it's kind of great. But throwing in Pigs at the beginning and end, I feel like just, one, it starts the album on the wrong tone, but then two, it kind of ends the album on the wrong tone. But aside from that, I think the three middle songs, the sort of bulk of it, are all really well written and really interesting to listen to. Prog rock is definitely a bit self-indulgent in just how much music is thrown in as basically filler. Like in a 17-minute song, there's basically no lyrics and the melody almost doesn't change at all. But that's more of a personal gripe and less of a direct criticism, where it just sort of like I get bored after a while where man's just strumming bass for like 5 minutes long. But aside from that, I thought this was good. I thought the contrast in the lyrics is really, really interesting, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about it more, but the idea that this album is basically like a spin on Animal Farm, except instead of being about Stalinism, it's about specifically capitalism. But also, if you sit down and look at the lyrics of Dogs, how it's all about the contradictions embedded in capitalism of hypocritical behavior. And then when you get to something like Sheeps, it does a really good job of like marrying the docile image of being a sheep with the religious symbolism that's used to kind of make people docile too. So like the lyrics are really interesting, and I'm sure there's a lot we could talk about there, but I enjoyed this. I thought this was good.
Okay, yeah. It is interesting, because I definitely agree with you that Pigs on the Wing, Part 1 and 2, are like, they're decent enough songs. I like them, but they are like oddly placed as the prologue and epilogue for the album, right? Like they're very tonally just different. And it's interesting to kind of like look at this in the progression of Pink Floyd albums, or not even the progression, but just on the spectrum of Pink Floyd albums, how for a long time they're really just working on making an album that is one song, and they have like moments where that fails and like to its detriment. Like I like things about Umaguma, particularly its album cover is really trippy and fun, but like it's just got like way too long of instrumental, nothing but instrumental and no lyrics to kind of spice things up. And then several tiny furry creatures gathered together in a cave is just fucking stupid. Fun but stupid. And then you got like the other side of it, which is where I think they reached perfection, which is Dark Side of the Moon, which beginning to end, that is a single song. And like I think that's great. It's a 43-minute song. And this is like right in the middle, where without the prologue and epilogue to this, it is just one big song. Like they perfectly flow into one into another. I can't stand to listen to Pink Floyd songs with like or Pink Floyd albums, I should say, with like ads, or like even, it's subtle, right? But like, you know, when you put a CD in and you hear the noise as it transitions between tracks, hate it. It ruins the fucking album. Because they're not
You'd hate listening to music with me in the car, because I will play an album and I'll play the album on shuffle. I won't listen to a straight album through.
No, it's an experience, Steve.
I know, you were 100% right, but I have no taste at all when it comes to music. I will literally put on Black Parade and shuffle it. I don't fucking care.
You're a terrible person. You should feel bad about yourself. You don't deserve to be on the back quotes of books.
Apparently not.
I'm going to go find every single copy of the trade Steve Baxi is quoted on the back of, and I'm going to like write in Sharpie, this guy doesn't listen to albums all the way through. He's trash. But like, so this is just an interesting one in that spectrum, that progression. I'm not sure. I think this comes after Dark Side of the Moon, even though it's like still striving for that single song thing. But I do think that I think you're right. Those two songs do kind of stand out from the album in a weird way. And I guess if you want to be generous, you can say that they're like intentionally meant to contrast everything else. If like the album is a critique of capitalist structures, then this is more the idea of like how life should be. But I don't know if that just quite works tonally or not. You know,
I don't think there's enough meat, and pun intended, there's not enough meat in Pigs on the Wing to make that argument, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I feel like with the other three songs, they are not super dense in lyrics, or they're not super lengthy in lyrics, but they're very dense in material.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot going on, just kind of line by line by line. If you just played, and I didn't test this theory, but if you just played part 1 and part 2 of Pigs on a Wing together, it'd just be kind of like a slow little like love song almost, but there's really not much more to it.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree. And again, I don't like those songs as much as the rest of the album. So if I do have any negatives about it, that is certainly one of them. I think you're definitely right to harp on that. I don't really know how much else I want to talk about those two songs because I don't think there were a lot of what the album is going for is anyway.
You mentioned, though, and I thought this was interesting because I didn't ever knew this album existed, but you did mention how this is an under-discussed Pink Floyd album. And I thought that was interesting when looking at the history of their discography because, while I'm not a big Pink Floyd fan, I know the popular stuff. Mm-hmm. And this was right before The Wall, which is arguably one of their biggest albums ever, if not their biggest album. And then it comes after Dark of the Moon and Wish You Were Here. And both of those are much bigger deals, at least like sales-wise. So it probably had like an unfortunate history being sandwiched between those two. But to be honest with you, of the Pink Floyd that I've listened to, this is probably my favorite.
That's interesting. I don't know, like, I think that might be part of it, the way it's sandwiched. But again, this was like the 70s where, you know, you wait nowadays for like a band to come out with an album. It takes like 5 years between albums, whereas the 70s, like, fucking every band had a new album like every year to 6 months, you know? It was fucking ridiculous by comparison. You know, the Doors were only together for like 5 years and they had like 12 albums or some shit. It's fucking insane.
A lot of punk bands around the same time were the same. They broke up pretty quickly. They all had like fucking 5 to 10 albums.
Yeah, it's insane how like the output in the 70s. The 70s is like a fucking musical and film renaissance. It's not even fair.
70s is like legitimately like the best era for almost all mediums because movies
except
are great,
animation.
Comics are great. Animation was barely an industry, so that's fair though. But like film, music, comics, novels, like there's a philosophy, like there's a lot fucking happening in the 70s.
I don't know, man. Fucking animation was pretty big before the 70s. It's a fucking dark age. I don't know what happened.
There was a lot of growing pains between the 50s, 60s, and 70s to get animation to where it is today.
My God. Like, I don't know. You look at stuff in the 40s and up into the 60s, it's pretty good. And the 70s just falls off a fucking... Like, you know that picture of the horse? Where it's got like this skill drum. The 70s are 100% this part where it's like a fucking stick figure.
It's fucking Hanna-Barbera's fault is what it is. Fucking Hanna-Barbera cartoons suck ass.
Probably. Anyway, this is about animals.
Alright.
But yeah, I think that it is kind of just sandwiched in between stuff. But even then, I don't know, it's just such a like sleeper hit, and I think it's because it's the least to do with stuff that like drugged out hippies would necessarily engage with, in America at least. Like, it's very explicitly anti-capitalist, but like I think the thing that's missed about the hippie movement in the United States is a very like fucking selfish movement. For all like the peace and love talk, most of them just wanted to go like live on communes and never have to work. It's a very like
100%.
self-centered and I guess particularly American idea of utopia. And so the idea of like you still can't be selfish, the idea of like that being selfish has a cost to your soul is something that I think doesn't quite like jive with the at least American audience at the time. That's just my speculation and theory. I'm sure there's plenty of stuff to prove me wrong or right on different sides, but that's like kind of a part of what I think maybe made this album not hit as hard. And also, in all fairness, even for the 70s, these tracks are really fucking long. Like, The Wall has a lot of tracks in it, and there are some long ones in there, but most of them are like in that 3 to 5 minute range. Dark Side of the Moon has, fewer tracks, and some of them are longer, but none of them go over like 8 minutes, I want to say. Whereas this one, with the exception of Pigs on the Wing, the shortest track is like 10 minutes. And so, unless the DJ really needed to go to the bathroom, you're not likely to get a lot of airplay for this as well.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting there about this not resonating with people is it's also because, more so than a lot of other counterculture music, this one's a little bit more challenging, or at least implicates everyone a little bit more than you're used to. Like, the problem with a lot of Sex Pistols songs, and this eventually comes to fruition with the history of Johnny Rotten as a person, but the problem with a lot of Sex Pistols songs is they're just kind of abstractly angry at the thing, and there's really no substance behind it beyond that. Like, what is anarchy in the UK about, except just general anarchy? And, like, over the years, Johnny Rotten has softened, become a much more conservative-leaning person. There's a lot of horror stories about him in his personal life, but like he softened on the Queen and the royal family and shit. And back in the day, he was always really annoyed about like prog rock and the idea of rock being like traditionalist and nostalgic, which is a really revisionist account of history because rock has always kind of been counterculture to a degree, like literally from Elvis onward. So it was always kind of acting in bad faith in those criticisms. But then when it was doing its own work, it tended to just kind of be anthems for being abstractly angry, anthems for being abstractly angry about Vietnam, being abstractly angry about the British government, being abstractly angry about Nixon or Watergate or whatever. But there was never really much responsibility assumed in those kinds of songs. Versus something like this, where I feel like it is a little bit more challenging and a little bit more complicated, and you do kind of have to wrestle with your part in the system. Because the consistent metaphor throughout this is there's the dogs, there's the pigs, and there's the sheep. And these 3 tiers of animal are 3 tiers of a class society. And the dog lyrics are really interesting because they're so like rhythmically contradictory. So like the way that song opens is you got to be crazy, you got to have a real need, you got to sleep on your toes, and when you're on your street, you got to be able to pick out the easy meat with your eyes closed, and then moving in silently downwind and out of sight. You got to strike when the moment is right without thinking. Like the idea that they're painting with this is effectively just that you have to be a walking contradiction. You have to be trusting and be able to stab someone in the back. You have to be able to look people in the eye without ever actually seeing them. And so crafting this image of a dog, this upper class business mentality, this epitome of capitalism, is you're basically creating a wolf in sheep's clothing. You're creating someone that is a walking contradiction. And then on the other end of it, when you have the sheep and the pigs, you have this image of people being docile but being fed docility, that they understand that the system is designed to just chew them up and spit them out, in this case, literally. But there's also this weird religious acceptance of it, that if you tell yourself the story over and over again of the religious imagery, of the idea that you're saved in the afterlife and whatever, then you make it go down your palate a little bit better. You don't actually change anything. And so that I thought was really interesting, where the idea wasn't just capitalism bad, it's that accepting of your fate in capitalism is also bad. And that's something that the hippie movement, like you mentioned, is not something they really did. They did eventually just kind of fizzle out into communes, often recreated conservative social values within their own communities. There wasn't like actually any sort of progressive agenda within hippie communities, and most of them just kind of fizzled out afterwards. That's why that's why the joke is that middle-aged dads all pretended to be hippies, because after a while they realized they didn't care about anything. And this kind of avoids that pitfall very quickly, which I enjoyed.
Yeah. And then I like so you talk about dogs, and I completely agree with your assessment as well as with sheep. And then pigs is the interesting one because it seems to create a distinction between the walking contradiction capitalist businessman of the dog and this like other tier of the pig, which I mean it's got like allusions to the White House and stuff in there, so it's clearly talking about being what the role that politicians play in a capitalist society as well as a distinction between that and a person of business. So I thought that was a really interesting way of like the person that like kind of the ruling class, if you will, as opposed to the business class of the person that controls the lives of others and like has a glee in it, like that line of "you're nearly a laugh, but you're really a cry" is just it's so like down looking and patronizing, and I don't know, I really like the distinction set up there because it's subtle, but there's a truth to it, and I find it impressive how it doesn't leave room to like say, but this side's okay. It's very I think intentional of picking out both conservative and liberal politicians within capitalist systems.
Yeah, I really liked towards the end of that song, they have that line, tight lips and cold feet. Like the whole idea that politicians are effectively just ambassadors of the status quo. That they say everything right, but at the end of the day, like you said, they're all just a joke and they're not saying anything of substance and they're not acting in any way. They have completely cold feet. And I like that it's sort of sandwiched between the sheep and the dog lyrics because it creates this picture that the dogs, the businessmen, are the ones that are in charge, the ones that are creating the agenda. And the pigs are the ones, the politicians rolling around in their own shit that feel like they're in charge, but actually aren't. And then at the end of the day, it's the sheep that follow along and suffer for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really like the way that this all blends together. And again, the musical journey that it kind of takes you on. I know that part didn't hit as much for you, but I just really like it. Waters would do this again. Sheep is the song that does it the most, where you get this like really high pitched kind of yell that it's not like a metal scream yell where he actually is screaming a note, and an instrument, in this case the guitar, will come in and pick up the same note, and they'll do some digital editing tricks to blend and fade them into each other so that you can't actually tell where the scream ends and the guitar takes over. And I really fucking like that. Waters will do that trick again in a really emotionally impactful way in his album The Final Cut, which is the last Waters album with the Pink Floyd name, even though I don't think David Gilmour was involved at that point. And my history might be a little murky. But like it's a trick he's a big fan of, and I think he maybe like goes a little overboard with it here, the number of times it happens in Sheep, but it is so goddamn effective and really cool the way that carries through. What you were talking about earlier of like you just get kind of bored, I definitely see that as like a criticism. I think that's very similar to like my thing about it's really hard to watch 70s films because they're all good, but they're also fucking long. The pacing so bad. And it's like, I think it's just, that generational divide of music where because I listen to these and these like helped inform my taste, I can't think of another way to like get into it. If you got into music in a different way, I don't know how well you could adapt to getting into Pink Floyd because it is very much a relic of its time. You couldn't fucking play this now. Like people like the like kind of droned and long form music, but not in a way that's like engaging and popular. They like it as background noise, They like their like lo-fi beats and stuff, to music to study to, stuff to like put on so they can distract their brain and just constantly be fed things. And I'm saying that because I'm one of those people who always needs something going on. But this isn't the case for me.
You're forgetting the other obvious use, which is we need sound bites to recycle into TikTok videos. Like
That too.
that's the primary form of engagement for like most popular pop songs at this point is they get insane amounts of plays from the fact that they could just be snipped into TikToks. And you can't do that with this. Like our whole concept of listening to music has changed a lot since this album had came out. This is probably an album that, among many, many other issues with Spotify's algorithm, is an album that kind of defies Spotify's algorithmic setup because there's really nothing else you can recommend sonically that sounds like this and be anywhere close to right. Like you can just do generically like what are bands that are vaguely 70s prog rock? What are bands vaguely similar to Pink Floyd? But you can't match this because it's not designed within those genre confines. Like if you like a Dua Lipa song, I can name you like 5 other pop songs that sound identical to it. It's not hard. It's designed that way on purpose. But not so much here. Like you can maybe like find a connoisseur of Pink Floyd and like they can bring you a list of like, well, this song from this album is kind of like this, song from that album is kind of like that. But it's not something that you can sort of quantify.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's because they as a band were just very, very experimental with everything that they could do. They were the ones that were kind of pushing a lot of the integration of technology into music. Like, you had the Beatles playing with it. Lennon liked the idea of being able to harmonize with himself, which I'm sure didn't piss Paul off in the slightest. And you had like other people playing with like little things, you know, Frampton with his like fucking weird tube thing and shit. But Pink Floyd was the kind of the pioneer. I don't know, maybe that's not fair. Pink Floyd, if not the inventors, were definitely the most successful at using actual effects and sounds and kind of doing soundscapes that weren't just music to kind of push and take the genre to different places. I don't think, you know, I had a friend growing up when we were both listening to music a lot in like middle school, high school, and he's like, man, I can't believe I wish I could have gone to a Pink Floyd concert. And I'm like straight up told him like, and my opinion has not changed all these years later, I never would have wanted to go to a Pink Floyd concert because the whole thing's designed around the album. It's not designed to be live. It's designed to be trippy and like this very personal experience. And so that's just kind of the way that they wrote and performed music. And I think it's ultimately what kind of led to the band breaking up is ever since Waters left, Gilmour has continued under the banner of Pink Floyd, but he's kind of just doing his own thing that end up being these like really long, trippy songs, and sometimes they got good lyrics, but there's not really like much depth to them. Like, he wrote the song Learning to Fly, which was about how he was learning to fly a plane at that point in his life, and he wanted to write a song about it. It's a good song, but like that's kind of that's all there is to it. It's like, oh, it's so beautiful and amazing, learning to do this new thing that's like completely outside of, you know, what people used to think was possible hundreds of years ago. I'm like, yeah, no, that's a beautiful emotion. That's kind of all where it starts and ends. And then Waters went off, and he didn't really care about doing like big musical journeys as much. He kind of knew his 1-2 tricks, and then he just really liked talking about his ideas. And so all of his songs on his solo stuff is just like fucking might as well just listen to spoken word poetry at that point. So there was like a magic that happened between those two working together. How much the keyboardist and drummer participated in that is kind of anyone's guess, I guess. I don't know.
Well, it is interesting with music that everything is obviously subjective to a degree, but you can still kind of talk about it with the language of objectivity. But music's one of those things where it just kind of hits everyone at a different wavelength, almost like comedy, where it's really hard to gauge what someone's sensitive to sonically for with this kind of music versus that kind of music. So like you can never really get into an argument and say that someone's 100% right or wrong about Pink Floyd being a good band or a bad band based on that. But you can kind of get into this territory of Pink Floyd's the kind of band where what you feel about them and how you interpret their lyrics often says more about you than it does about necessarily the song itself, and I always find that really interesting and rewarding. Because obviously Waters had a lot to say about not only his life but just politics and life in general. And you could certainly have a very thorough reading of something like The Wall based on his specific life experiences that's really interesting to talk about. But a lot of it is also just kind of baked into what are the lyrics or the images that you personally are latching onto, and why are they the framework for your interpretation. This is a little bit more concrete than that, which I really like, where you can certainly spend a lot of time like thinking about why the animal metaphor is here, or what aspects of capitalism you're personally choosing to focus on. But unlike a lot of other conceptual albums, specifically as time moves on, you get to like the 90s or the early 2000s, there's like a clear narrative here from beginning, middle, and end. Like there's a story being told from the top, the middle, to the bottom. It's structurally really coherent, it's lyrically really coherent, and the metaphor is extremely consistent all the way throughout. And that makes it a lot easier to talk about than a lot of the other stuff that he ended up doing or did before.
No, I'd agree. It's one of those albums I really do like this thing. Again, I don't really hear it talked about a lot. It's very just an interesting little piece of the career, of the band's career. Did you, by chance, see what the album cover was for this?
The factory with the pig flying through?
Yes, that's an actual power factory in I believe London, or somewhere in the UK. And they actually like blew up a giant pig balloon to put over the factory, and then they like lost the balloon as it just kind of floated the fuck away. Which I don't know, it's kind of like an interesting little life reflecting art kind of moment in a way where I think it's really cool, the level of thought put into it, because it's just this like, you know, for all the criticism that like Soviet architecture got for like the brutalist like lack of beauty, just pure functionality aspects, is like, yeah, but then you have like this fucking eyesore of a factory in the middle of the goddamn country, and it's just like spewing smoke, like these huge smokestacks just spewing out. It's kind of funny because I remember I was recently, or still am, watching through Doctor Who. And in one of the Hartnell episodes, one of the more famous stories, the Dalek invasion of Earth, see that fucking factory in the background of some of the shots because they actually got to shoot in London.
Funny.
Yeah. So it's kind of like, you know, weird for me just as a fan of Pink Floyd, where like, you know, the album cover is so very stylized. I was actually surprised. I remember the first time I found out it was a photograph and not just like, you know, very realistic painting or something. So it is interesting to see that that's kind of like just what they had to grow up and be around and experience, and just seeing that thing just disgusting in the city skylines and just spewing smoke out into the air is kind of like a really gross image, you know.
It really kind of speaks to what was popular around that time in like a lot of art movements in the late 60s and 70s of like conceptual art. Because when I saw that album, I thought someone really could have just framed that and put it up in a gallery somewhere, and someone would have spent like an hour talking about it. Because it does kind of have that impact. It's that sort of thing that they were doing with conceptual art in those days, where you take an image that is meant to be benign and kind of accentuate the things about it that make the normal thing seem so much more bizarre or out of place. Do you know who Adrian Piper is by chance?
I don't think so.
So Adrian Piper is a conceptual artist. I don't know if she's still alive or not, but she was big in the late 60s and early 70s, and she did a lot of work talking about race through her art. And like she's got this one really popular self-portrait called Accentuating My Negroid Features. And the idea is just she drew a portrait of herself in pencil or charcoal or something, but she like enhanced the things of it that are traditionally black to make herself look more like a caricature, to see what people were kind of zooming in on when they characterized you as black. But another one that was really interesting that I really like is she did this thing where she took a rag and put a bunch of like rotten smelling shit on it and put it in her mouth, and then she sat in the back of buses. And the idea was she was creating in this performance art the feeling of what racism was like. This idea that like you'd relegate people to the back of the bus as if they were this horrible, rotten thing that had to be in the back and had to be gagged. And it was really interesting stuff, and I really liked a lot of what she did. But that sort of theory of art, I feel like that was really popular in that time, in that zeitgeist, even with like Andy Warhol and pop art, is all over this album, because the whole idea is just, if you want to talk about capitalism, if you want to talk about class or issues of class, a lot of what you have to do is not necessarily talk about the ins and outs of political policies and economics or any of that shit, even though that's important. But really all you got to do is like take a picture of a very normal thing in your day-to-day life, like a big ugly factory, and just home in on how fucking weird it is that this is the kind of world we live in. And I really liked that. I thought that sort of fit into that aesthetic conversation super well.
I agree. That is really interesting. And, like, it's funny because what you're talking about there, that movement, that whole, like, postmodernist art movement is, you know, it's still looked down upon. And I think, you know, in a lot of cases, rightly so, because, like, is this even really art? Well, we're talking about it. Yeah, but we're talking about it because it's bad, right? Like, that's not what anyone wants. It's like, oh, this fucking movie was so shitty. Hey, but you're talking about it. Yeah, I'm talking about how it was a shitty movie.
A lot of that postmodern pop art stuff, I feel like it's a bad rap from a lot of like bad faith actors that are not like trying to engage with it. But some of it can certainly be sort of self-indulgent. But I think it's sort of, in a broad sense, it kind of speaks to exactly what's here in Pink Floyd, which is you're trying to democratize the idea that anything can be art, that it's not just what's in a museum, that sort of so-called institutional theory of art, that like the Nazis were really famous for this, about this idea that like art hit a certain kind of peak and then all of modern art was bad because it wasn't realistic and it wasn't regal. And now a lot of the same people that sort of begrudge postmodern art are people with that same sort of sensibility, that like they think that our aesthetic sensibilities have gone down, and they really haven't. It's really just the opposite. It's this idea that like anything you can look at can be talked about in a way that makes it artistic, and that in and of itself should be the kind of the value, because art at its best is trying to make something out of an everyday life experience. So if you can sort of reverse engineer that and make everyday life experiences into art, then you've kind of reached that perfect equilibrium.
Certainly, and what I was kind of driving at, though, is this is something that is doing that everyday into art thing without it just coming off as lazy. You know, there's like that very like clear distinction of, what's the fucking example? Because this was like controversial as of late, was the fucking banana duct taped to the canvas, right? Of like, that was a huge story, it was everywhere. And then it came out a second time because someone walked in the gallery and ate the banana and put it back. And then that was all over the news cycle. And then, like, 6 months or maybe a year after it cycled, it came out. No, it was done as a stunt to get people to talk about it because they knew something selling for that much would be newsworthy, would generate the conversation. I'm like, yeah, that's fine, whatever, but it's still like there's no technical skill to that level of art. I think is a perfectly fair criticism. At that point, you might as well talk about YouTube thumbnails being high art, right? Well, it got a lot of people to click on it. Like, yes, but that doesn't mean there's any technical skill to it. And so this is an album that I like because it's like, it's playing with those same ideas, but it's still very highly skilled art. It's something that you don't have to argue whether or not it's art. It just is on its face value, and then its deeper themes make it all the richer for that. And I really appreciate that about this. Is Pink Floyd, I don't think, ever got lazy with their art.
Well, that sort of circles back to what we opened this review with, which is the contrast between the punk bands of the time and the
I thought you were going to talk about
the
The Flash.
Well, that too. So you see, just because you could make a Batman movie in The Flash doesn't mean you should have. Especially if you were going to bring Michael Keaton back without Tim Burton. But anyway, we'll get to that in a couple of weeks. But no, it sort of goes back to that the contrast between the prog rockers and the punk rockers. Of punk has this early philosophy of it sounds bad on purpose. That it's the garage band vibe. It's the you're a bunch of kids and your friends and you're angry at the world and you're angry at your power in the world because of a bunch of old people, and so you're moved by music, and so you decide to express that lack of power and that anger into instruments and perform largely on purpose pretty badly because that's just kind of the expression of your ideology at the time. And certainly that's a pretty marked contrast to something like Pink Floyd, which has like literary merits and symbolism and motifs throughout and a narrative structure through its lyrics. And one is clearly trying to be a little bit more structural in its storytelling, and the other is trying to do more of that postmodern performance piece where like the medium itself is the message. The idea that it sounds bad on purpose. Not only that, but it's also that it's this sort of imminent critique of what's going on, that the people in this band are real people, that they are kids, that they are angry, that they are smashing their instruments. And the expression of those feelings in their instruments is the message of the piece, independent of what any of the lyrics might say. And I think both of those avenues are really valid and they're interesting. There are certainly a lot of like punk bands, not to keep picking on Sex Pistols, but they're the really only big ones.
Go ahead. Please.
Not to keep picking on Sex Pistols, but they were the big ones around this time in contrast to Pink Floyd, because specifically Johnny Rotten didn't like Pink Floyd. Or says he didn't. He's kind of reneged on that too because he's a piece of shit, but you know, whatever.
Okay, I've not bothered to look up a goddamn thing about Johnny Rotten's life. You've kept bringing it up, so after you make your point, can you please tell me some of the shitty things Johnny Rotten has done? Thank you. Go on.
Oh, we can definitely talk about that. But yeah, no. But no, so the sort of problem you lean into here is that, like we were talking about with the hippies, you run into this issue where doing that, it's not that it's invalid per se, but like you're not allowing the music or the art or the message to really have any accountability or responsibility outside of like that expression. Like it's one thing for me to get home from school and blow off steam by playing Call of Duty multiplayer online and shooting off a bunch of people's heads. But like that doesn't amount to anything after a point. And especially when it comes to like complex lyricism and stuff, without something that like really sort of anchors you in a direction, it's very easy to just take the energy and co-opt it for whatever you want. And it sort of speaks to exactly what Sex Pistols ultimately became, which is it was the ultimate band of the anti-establishment anarchy that then just kind of became establishment and anarchy, you know? Sex Pistols wrote a whole song called God Save the Queen about how shitty the fucking royal family. And then they unironically played it when the Queen died. Like, what the fuck? Like, come on. It's the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, you had one job. Your one job was to make a song about, no, God, don't save the Queen. And then you played it like you didn't mean it? No, fuck that. Fuck that.
That's right.
But that sort of speaks to your point there. I mean, and again, there are other bands that I think sort of toe that line really well, like the Ramones. I don't know if you listen to Ramones.
A little bit.
They're sort of in between there. They're sort of in between Pink Floyd and a traditional punk rock band, I feel like, where they are a little bit more complex in the lyrics. But also, I could see a strong argument for they're not particularly good at anything they do. They're just a bunch of kids who talk about political themes in their music. And it's a little bit more put together than something like Sex Pistols is, but it's also not like it's not as competent as something like Pink Floyd is.
Mm-hmm. All right, so tell me about some of the shitty shit Johnny Rotten's done, because I need this ammunition. I've never bothered to look up anything, but now I'm like, ooh, good. Now I can talk about how not only is he an idiot, but also an asshole.
Yeah, I mean, there's the thing about the...
Of course Steve cuts out right when he's about to drop the T.
My bad. So obviously there's the thing about the... There's a lot of stuff about as time has gone on, reneging on things that he's talked about in his lyrics expressly. He's talked about how gay people shouldn't be allowed to have kids because it's effectively like raising a kid with one parent, because you need the both genders to raise them right, or some shit like that. He's very selective about his religious criticism. He talks about like the sex abuse scandals of the Catholic Church, but then also has like no bones about any other denomination of Christianity whatsoever. He's very mad at the Bush years, but very happy at the Obama years. He had a friend who was basically a known sex pest in the industry and covered for him for a very long time. He's made statements in support of conservative leaders in the UK as time has gone on. So he's basically gone from like an anarchist to like an establishment Republican at this point.
I love it. That's so, that makes me so happy.
No, like if you want a picture of like the epitome of what people mean when they say musicians sell out, it's the Sex Pistols.
That's so fucking funny.
And this has sort of been like a known thing for a while. I think there was a minute there in like the early 2000s where a bunch of kids got really into Sex Pistols because they discovered punk music for the first time. And then all those kids grew up and realized that the Sex Pistols are the worst punk band. I'm sure Matt could probably tell you more about this stuff than I can, but it's still funny.
They started the genre and sucked so hard at it.
They almost killed it.
That's so funny. Yeah, I don't know. I guess I just have the controversial opinion that music should be, good. Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting. I'm not sure how much else I have to say about Animals. I just like this album quite a bit. It's not, I don't even think it's my favorite or even in like my top 5 or anything, but I just think it's good. I think it's under-discussed, underappreciated, underrated album. And I just dig talking about it. I'm really glad you enjoyed it, Steve.
I appreciate that. I did not expect to enjoy it. Okay.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead and say what you're saying.
No, I didn't expect to enjoy it. So when you said Pink Floyd, I'm like, fine. And then I listened to it, I'm like, oh, never mind. This is good.
Okay, good. Glad. One thing, I did say it had other complaints, and this is one of them. So, again, I'm talking about how I've been a Pink Floyd fan for years, and as much as I enjoy and truly love Roger Waters' lyrical complexity, I do wish that he was a little bit better of a singer. Like, he's able to, like, actually carry a note and properly sing. But, he has a tendency to, like, kind of skew pronunciation for the sake of a rhyme, or just accent, or I don't know what kind of makes words hard to hear. So I will say I spent I don't know, I was probably like 24 before I realized that in Pigs it's haha charade, not how harsh and right. And I wouldn't really mention that. That would just be, oh, Ian, you're the idiot thing. But there's quite a few Pink Floyd songs where it's not just my experience, where like other people have had this experience. I remember getting into an argument in high school over one of the songs on Dark Side of the Moon about whether the lyrics were "the lunatic" or "the road you take." And so I do see that as a pretty consistent problem with Roger Waters, as I often I can't quite tell what he's saying with his really, really good lyrics, and that's, I don't know, that's weird. It's funny. It's probably my biggest complaint about him as an artist is sometimes he either stretches or skews something, or it's accent. I'm not quite sure. Maybe it's all those different things at different times, but that one stands out to me.
Maybe I'm just kind of numb to that, because I feel like, specifically depending on like what kind of like watching, the ones that excel at rapping very, very quickly tend to like fuck up pronunciations on purpose for the sake of a rhyme, because it's just easier to say the word wrong and get into the next verse than it would be to try and rhyme something appropriately. So that's never really bothered me because I feel like that's just been a thing we've done for the last 20 years.
No, certainly. It's just that, like, it leaves a lot of room for misinterpretation. It's like rap's a little different because it's basically spoken word but fast, whereas singing it out like already has a level of detachment from the word itself. You know?
Sure.
So it's just one of those things I've noticed. And again, the fact that it's not just me being an idiot. Like, there's a consistent record of people misunderstanding Pink Floyd lyrics, and it's kind of funny to me. The same one I was talking about earlier from Dark Side of the Moon, I remember downloading that album track by track off of LimeWire back in the day, and even saw it in the title. They'd gotten the lyric wrong. So it's pretty funny that it's like that wide and consistent and shit. I find that very amusing.
No, that's fair. That's understandable. Unlike his singing.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, in a battle of the prog rock, slow melodic melody with very spoken wordy singing, I think I like Pink Floyd better than Nirvana at the very least.
See, I feel like that's such a completely different era. I would not classify them together at all. I mean, I
think so. I feel like they're kind of one is the next.
I mean, I definitely see the progression in music that you're talking about, but again, it's just such like a different take because like Nirvana is almost kind of the baby of like Pink Floyd and punk, right? And not like the hate baby. Like, these two people clearly are not going to raise that child together.
That's a divorce waiting to happen.
That was clearly a child that was meant to save the marriage and is going to do no such thing. That child's going to need years of therapy to understand why its parents hate it so much.
To be fair, there is a depth from there because then you slide over into like the pop punk on one side and sort of the grungy metalcore on the other side. Mm-hmm. So there was definitely a break that happened there.
I know, I agree. It's funny. No, I mean, I'd always rather listen to Roger Waters because, again, I mean, he's actually singing and he's actually, you know, competent enough to hit a note intentionally and hold it. You know, there is a lot of emotion in his songs, but it doesn't just devolve into pure screaming, which I always appreciate. I know that you're probably on the opposite end of that spectrum, but
I need my music to be more screaming, unfortunately.
Yeah. Steve's like just instead of metal or punk music anymore, Steve just gets recordings of women giving birth, not the actual baby coming out process, just all the screaming that leads up to it.
I was talking to Matt about this earlier. I've been like lately, so like things like Drowning Pool and shit from the early 2000s. I don't know why, but that's kind of just been my vibe lately.
Gotcha. All right, well, I think that'll do it for this week's episode. I'm gonna make Alfie pick for next time. It's fucking unreal.
He already did.
Oh, he did? I forget.
It's in the chat. He picked American Hustle.
Oh, that's right. Okay, so we'll be reviewing American Hustle next week. Once I figure out what that's on.
Shit, you're right. I actually don't know what it's on. I'm gonna kick his ass for making me watch that again.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Now I'm excited. All right, everyone, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
And I am not a musician.
And we are your geeky gentlemen, and we will be discussing things. If you're not a musician, have you considered becoming a punk rocker?
Have you considered subscribing to my Patreon?